Down. Glenn, you and I have been speaking a lot about Judge Boasberg. He's the judge presiding over this case regarding whether or not Trump has the ability to deport migrants without any due process. Now, this case has gone all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court where they finally weighed in. So can you explain what just happened at that court?
Yeah, Brian, this is actually a bad development for the Trump administration, and here's why. All 9 Supreme Court justices just told the Trump administration in no uncertain terms that if you are intending to deport people, including under the Alien Enemies Act, which you may or may not be able to do, the Supreme Court didn't take that up. If you're going to keep trying to deport people, you've got to give them their constitutional rights of notice and opportunity to be heard. In other words, before you stuff them on a plane and send them to be imprisoned in El Salvador or anyone else, you have to give them advance notice of what you're going to try to do to them. They have to have an opportunity to go to court, be heard by a judge, make their case as to why they should not be deported. Because here is what Judge Boasberg's case involves, and this is the case that was just decided by the Supreme Court. Judge Boasberg issued a temporary restraining order when he got wind, because suit was filed in D.C., that Trump was deporting people without honoring their due process rights. Judge Boasberg immediately put a temporary restraining order in place and said, you must stop right now, and you must not have any other planes take off full of Venezuelan immigrants heading to El Salvador, and if planes are in the air, they must turn around. Well, today, Brian, the Supreme Court said, well, we are going to take up the legality, the propriety of that temporary restraining order. And here's what they said. And, this is really kind of an ugly development. The 5-justice majority said, we're just going to decide this on procedural issues, and we're not going to say one word about the fact that the Trump administration unconstitutionally deported hundreds of Venezuelan migrants. So they decided that issue, and it looks like this case will now have to shift over from federal court in D.C., move out to Texas. The nature of the proceeding will change. It'll go from a lawsuit that was brought as a class action to try to put a stop to all of these illegal deportations to a case-by-case treatment of the detention of each Venezuelan immigrant who's still being held in Texas pending deportation. But the good news is the 4-justice minority would not let that silence from the 5-justice majority go, and they laid out in their dissent, as authored by Justice Sotomayor, but it was joined by Justice Kagan, by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and it was even joined in part by Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And what that dissent did, Brian, is it laid out the blatant and dangerous violation of the Constitution, the due process rights of these Venezuelan migrants that the Trump administration perpetrated. And then they went on to disagree with, the procedural treatment that the majority of justices gave this matter. But the bottom line is, all 9 justices, and believe it or not, there was a separate, very short concurring opinion authored by, of all people, Justice Kavanaugh, saying, let me emphasize, all 9 justices are on the same page that anybody who the Trump administration intends to deport must get their constitutional due process rights of notice and opportunity to be heard. But conspicuously absent from the 5-justice majority opinion was any criticism or even acknowledgement that the Trump administration has really grossly violated the constitutional rights of hundreds of Venezuelan migrants already.
Now, on its face, this might look like a win for the Trump administration because they didn't rule in accordance with what Judge Boasberg said, but they basically just shut the case down on procedural grounds. They said that we would rule on this on the merits, but it's not in the right court. It needs to be in Texas, and it can't be class action suit. It has to be on an individualized basis. Is that generally correct?
Brian, that's such a great point because, of course, the Trump administration is pounding its chest and crowing about how it's won a resounding victory. But here's the thing.
Right.
They were just called on the carpet for violating the Constitution for hundreds of Venezuelan migrants previously by not giving them notice and opportunity to be heard. And now all 9 justices have banded together and said, they haven't all said that was wrong, but moving forward, they all said, everybody you try to deport, regardless of how you try, under what legal provision, you have to honor their due process rights. I would actually call that a victory for the Constitution and for the due process rights of anybody that Trump tries to deport moving forward.
Glenn, quick question on why they did opt to bring this case from Washington, D.C. as opposed to Texas, where they were actually picked up. Is it because it was against the federal government, and so knowing that the federal government, the seat of the government, is in Washington, D.C., they thought that this would be an appropriate venue for this case?
Yeah, it's an advanced sort of procedural question, and it's a great one. Here is why. These Venezuelans, through their lawyers, said, we're not contesting our detention. You're welcome to detain us as long as we get our notice and opportunity to be heard. So attacking the legality of one's detention is why you bring a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, but they weren't attacking their detention, which is why I think the 4-justice minority is right and the 5-justice majority is wrong. But then secondarily, they said, no, we're going to bring a class action because we believe that the Trump proclamation, which was signed in Washington, D.C., as you point out, invoking the Alien Enemies Act of, I think it's 1798, you're completely misusing it. You're using it in an unlawful and unconstitutional way. And that's why we brought...
So the crime, so to speak, actually took place in D.C. because the crime didn't have to do with these migrants' detention. The crime has to do with Trump wrongly invoking a federal statute from within the White House in Washington, D.C.
Exactly right. And importantly, all of the justices in this new opinion said, listen, this is just about the temporary restraining order and about what kind of a suit should be brought. This does not even touch on whether Donald Trump lawfully or unlawfully invoked the Alien Enemies Act. And in fact, Justice Sotomayor goes to great lengths to say, oh, by the way, that will be litigated in the future. And let me explain why the Trump administration is likely to lose that. And she ticks through the reasons. So this really is a procedural, narrow, and even something of a temporary ruling. But let me add this, Brian. People may remember that when Judge Boasberg ordered there would be no more deportations, no planes should take off, and those that were in the air should turn around, and the Trump administration violated those court orders. There is a potential contempt proceeding that is ongoing in the Boasberg case, and this ruling by the Supreme Court will absolutely not impact or moot out, fancy way to say cancel out, those contempt hearings. Why? Because the Supreme Court has ruled many times over that the government, and indeed any party, any litigant, any person, must obey court orders, even if those court orders are later successfully challenged and found to be invalid. So I predict that Judge Boasberg contempt proceedings against the Trump administration will continue, notwithstanding this reversal of the restraining order by the Supreme Court.
Finally, let's finish off with this. We know that this specific case was shot down by the Supreme Court because they didn't have standing to bring it in the jurisdiction that they brought it in. Is there another case that already satisfies these requirements that's currently ongoing? Or do we have to wait for one of these wrongly deported migrants to rebring the case only in Texas, where they actually have proper jurisdiction, and just to play the whole process out?
Yeah, so well, our viewers may remember there is another deportation case, a gentleman named Garcia, who was wrongfully, even the Trump administration said, we were wrong, we screwed up.
They called it an administrative error.
Administrative error. Boy, I'm sure that's comforting to Mr. Garcia, who's being held in that dangerous prison in El Salvador, when he had a court order from a judge saying the federal government may not deport him to El Salvador. So there are other cases kicking around in the system involving deportations, the legality or illegality of those deportations. But I have a feeling you're going to see additional cases now brought as a result of this new Supreme Court ruling. People will have to start filing petitions for a writ of habeas corpus attacking the legality of their detention. Those will be kicking around in court probably for a long time to come.
Glenn, where do we stand as of right now in terms of the Trump administration's ability to continue deporting these people without due process? Like, I know that you just mentioned that all of these Supreme Court justices were adamant in their demand that this administration actually give these people due process.
Brian, I'm glad you asked me that question because Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, takes this exact point on. And here is what she tells the Trump administration. Indeed, it's a pointed warning from the minority of the justices who signed on to this dissent. She said, to the extent the government, the Trump administration, removes even one individual without affording him notice and a meaningful opportunity to file and pursue habeas relief, the government, does so in direct contravention of an edict by the United States Supreme Court, period, exclamation point. So I added the exclamation point. But look, she puts the Trump administration on notice. Hear me now. All 9 justices said, don't do it again moving forward. You did it for 200 or 300 immigrants already. Don't do it again, or you're directly violating an edict of the Supreme Court. Brian, when all 9 justices come together to make that point, that is something that we don't see every day coming out of the Supreme Court.
All right, well, we will, of course, continue to stay on top of this issue. For anybody watching it, if you want to continue to follow along and support independent media more broadly, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.